A bolt of impossible purple fire carves open the polluted heavens of a distant forge world, turning the smoke-heavy sky into a wound of shimmering light. From within that fracture steps Aldrif Odinsdottir, eldest daughter of Asgard, her wings unfurling in a storm of feathers and radiant force. The scent of molten metal and burning prayers fills her senses as she descends, ribbons coiling around her like living blades awaiting command. She feels the universe shift against her presence, as if the very fabric of reality is confused by what she is and uncertain whether to bow or break. Before we descend into the chaos of this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legends and dark histories from the Warhammer 40k universe. Her landing sends ripples through Ferrocrete that has endured 10,000 years of industrial strain, yet the ground softens beneath her feet as though unsure how to receive a being shaped by a realm of gods. Aldrif stands tall between towering manufactoria and cathedral-sized engines that hum with trapped machine spirits, their binary whispers rising in startled confusion. The Allspeak turns their mechanical lamentations into meaning, allowing her to hear every anxious chant and every trembling calculation echoing through the planet's vast network of sanctified metal. This is no simple battlefield, no realm of frost giants or cosmic titans. This is a galaxy where gods bleed openly, where war is worship, and where machines themselves beg for deliverance. Aldrif breathes the heavy air and feels the warp pressing at the edge of her thoughts like a predator testing the scent of something unfamiliar. She knows instantly that she has crossed into a place ruled not by balance, but by an endless hunger for survival. And in that moment, as alarms rise and the forge world stirs to confront the intruder, she understands that her arrival is not an accident. It is the beginning of a reckoning. Aldrif descends through waves of furnace heat and drifting ash, her wings beating against an atmosphere thick with soot and restless machine spirits. The forge world stretches in every direction like an endless skeleton of industry, its smokestacks rising higher than mountains, its forges glowing like open wounds in the planet's crust. Each thunderous heartbeat of the manufactoria shakes the ground beneath her, and the vibrations carry whispers of devotion, fear, and exhaustion from countless laborers bound to their sacred duty. The air itself feels alive, heavy with the metallic tang of iron and the lingering aftertaste of burned prayers offered to a god she has never known. Every breath floods her senses with the bitterness of sacrifice. Here, hope is an ember buried beneath layers of oil and despair. The broken sky flickers with static, and through it she sees orbital platforms shifting into alert status, their machine spirits stirring like ancient sentinels awakening to a threat beyond comprehension. Then she feels it, the warp. An unfamiliar pressure slides across her consciousness, subtle at first, then insistent, like a new scent carried on poisoned wind. It hums with the weight of 1,000 emotions that are not her own, vibrating with the echoes of tortured dreams and fervent belief. It pulls and pushes, neither fully hostile nor welcoming, but undeniably aware of her presence. Aldrif's warrior instincts sharpen. The laws she once relied upon, the rhythms of magic, the will of the cosmos, the delicate balance between realms, do not hold sway here. This universe moves according to rules born from entropy, faith, and unending conflict. Power behaves differently, resisting her understanding while simultaneously testing her resolve. She takes her first steps upon the Ferrocrete ground, her ribbons shifting like predators tasting the air. Every forge flare, every metallic groan, every distant scream tells her the same truth. She has entered a realm shaped by eternal war, and whatever purpose brought her here will demand more from her than any hunt she has ever known. In the wake of the fracture in the sky and the thunder of falling ruins, something old and impossible lay half-buried beneath the twisted ribs of a collapsed manufactorum. It was not shaped like anything the Forge World's craftsmen had ever conceived. The device wore geometry that seemed to argue with the eye, curves folding into angles that refused to meet, planes that looped back on themselves like a logic puzzle made flesh. 6 sigils burned across its surface, arranged in a sequence that suggested purpose rather than ornament, each symbol humming at a different pitch. Where the device touched the air itself trembled, as if physics had noticed a new law and was reconsidering its definition. Aldrif approached with the measured step of a hunter, not the careless stride of a conqueror. Her ribbons drifted at her sides like patient serpents. She knelt and reached for the metal with a hand that had held weapons forged in frozen stars and sacred spears in halls older than kingdoms. The moment her skin met the artifact, something in the world tilted. The sigils answered in a chorus of light and tone, a language older than spoken words, yet comprehensible to something in her mind. The Allspeak unfolded the device's resonance, and, for an instant, she recognized the intent behind the pattern, an attempt to balance forces, to measure weights that could not be weighed by ordinary instruments. That recognition was not private for long. The aegis of equilibrium, as the planet's whispered traditions would later call it, radiated more than power. It broadcasted a signature into the warp like a bell struck at the center of a cathedral. Psychers felt the pulse as a memory that did not belong to them. Astropaths aboard distant vessels twitched and stuttered in their trance, and the machine spirits of orbitals and engines registered an unfamiliar command pattern, as if a new firmware had arrived from someplace beyond the galaxy. Men and priests in lower levels felt hair lift on their arms. Children stopped mid-cry. Somewhere in the void, an incomprehensible pattern began to repeat. Touching the artifact was not a passive act. The device reached back, mapping the contours of Aldrif's mind and the deep logic of her species. It measured her thresholds, her appetite for order, her methods of control. The sigils shifted color in response, humming softer when they met comprehension and brighter when they encountered resistance. There was a hint of intention behind the geometry, as though the aegis could not only calculate but also decide. For a being who had lived under the cold light of Asgardian law, who had spent ages hunting by rules of balance and blood, the recognition brought a flicker of rational satisfaction. For a galaxy bred on faith and appetite, the resonance was a provocation. When the aegis spoke, it did not use human words. It transmitted patterns of consequences, visions of how a single nod of its function could reroute rivers, extinguish harvests, or erase entire districts and leave the rest sane enough to live. Those patterns echoed through the warp and through circuits alike. The Astronomican's lesser channels picked up the signature and forwarded it like a rumor. An old inquisitorial scryer at a remote listening post wrote in a margin that the pulse felt like a judgment without clerical robes. Across systems, the signature amplified, drawing attention not because it demanded worship, but because it offered answers to questions long thought unanswerable. How to solve scarcity, how to end famine, how to stop nations from grinding themselves to bone. The possibilities reached ears that wanted them and mouths that feared them. That first contact set off a chain. It changed how the planet behaved in the smallest details. Mills slowed, conveyor belts halted, and the mechanism of prayer that kept factory hearts beating stuttered as if the world were catching its breath. Machine spirits adjusted their sung rights to the new frequencies. The aegis did not scream domination. It spoke in an austere voice of arithmetic and closure. Its presence made simple equations into instruments of fate. Aldrif felt the pressure of the device against her palm and understood that whatever it did, whatever its purpose, the galaxy would respond. Old powers would wake, hidden councils would convene. The aegis had been unearthed, and that unearthing announced a point of convergence. The moment the aegis woke, alarms replied. Orbital platforms that had not changed position in centuries rotated on their mounts with a speed born of protocol more than choice. Void batteries sealed their glyph-bearing casings, and lancet-like beams stitched toward the rupture in the sky. But the weapons behaved as if a hand had reached inside the firing arc and stopped the world's breath. Beams froze in mid-space like threads caught in sticky resin. Projectiles slowed as if a viscous medium had been poured through vacuum. Torpedoes hummed without moving, their guidance fonts looping into staccato prayers as machine spirits sought meaning in an event outside their liturgy. Machine spirits did not simply fail, they sang out in pain. Their binary hymns, normally low and confident, rose into unsure, broken cadences. Tech adepts gathered around consoles that had been their altars for generations and ran rites of recalibration, and their voices were edged with genuine fear. In the cathedral rooms of the Mechanicum priests, chords of red-clad techs chanted oaths and fed archaic algorithms into devices that spat up numbers the adepts did not understand. Sanctified calculators returned contradictory answers. Magnetic flux readings did not merely misalign, they rewrote each other. The sacred logic of their rituals seemed inadequate by degrees that made the adepts whisper of miracles or heresies depending on who listened. The planet's priests also rose from their niches and lit braziers, their voices threaded with the tech priests' data streams, forming a strange duet of chant and calculation. Theologically, the Aegis could be framed as an omen, a divine test, or a blasphemous engine. Some priests denounced it as an artifact of the dark ages of technology, an instrument best sealed and burned. Others saw in its sigils a new language of salvation. The two views clashed in back corridors and raised platforms, slipping into threats and excommunications. In the end, both schools of thought agreed on one thing: they did not understand it. Civilians felt the planet's anxiety as a physical thing. Work crews abandoned their posts, the conveyor belts left half-filled with raw ore, and the underhive's informal markets jammed with frightened bodies. Voxcasters carried clipped directives from governors. A governor-militant analog ordered containment, but his commands arrived as a squeal of interference and unhelpful static. The local commissariat read the signs with a grim set of faces and prepared moral platitudes as if the right words could shore up the nerves of millions. On the orbital decks, Admiralty officers attempted to retake control with logic and brute force. Tactical screens filled with vectors and convergences, their feed lines suddenly annotated with errant data flagged by machine spirits. Senior officers shouted protocols, and engine rooms sang the old prayers louder, but even the most devout technicians felt their faith in routine crumble a degree with each failed volley. That failure was not merely technical, it tasted like an interrogation of presupposed order. And always in the center of the turmoil, the Aegis glowed and hummed. Its sigils did not gloat, they observed, they adjusted. Each failed attack on or near its field fed new patterns into the device, and the device fed those patterns back, not in cruelty, but in the cold arithmetic of consequence. The planet responded with fear, faith, and calculation, and all three proved inadequate to the problem before them. In that space between the attempted violence and the device's patient logic, the world discovered its own fragility, a revelation that would not remain local for long. Aldrif walked through the ruins like a judge moving through a courthouse of loss. Hab blocks yawned open in sharp-edged wounds, stairwells collapsed into jagged catacombs, and the air was thick with dust and the sharp tang of burnt servitors. Her ribbons twined at her sides and, when necessary, lashed like living whips that carved through falling timbers and the copper and ceramic hides of scavenged automata. In her hands the blades were simple, extensions of intent. She moved through the wreckage with a precision born of a lifetime stalking prey across frozen plains and misted valleys, but this was not a hunt for trophies. This was an inventory of human cost. Her allspeak translated the panicked prayers and the careful calculations of the Mechanicus into a chorus she could bear like a litany. She heard the grief of a mother turning in the mouth of a child, the precise cadences of a tech adept murmuring a failed formula, the bark of a commissar trying to marshal courage. Each voice entered her mind without friction, adding data to a running count. She did not merely hear words, she understood the statistical weight of need and the arithmetic of resources. The numbers were crude: how many mouths were left in a district, how many tons of food could be salvaged, how long the water purification engines could be kept running with torn belts and damaged condensers. The hunter in her computed survival curves in seconds. Her choices had always been strict and surgical. A wounded stag might be mercy-killed. A predator might be allowed to roam if its existence served a greater balance. This place offered no neat binaries. Lives were entangled with infrastructure, doctrine, and fervor. Yet instinct and acquired law pushed her toward a decision that would make the theologians stagger. She ran tests with the Aegis where she could, nudges that reallocated a shaft's power, a small recalibration that allowed a water pump to last another week, a subtle adjustment that turned a stockpile room into a functioning granary for a month. Those microacts kept pockets of life breathing. The sigils hummed approval at times, but in other moments, the device suggested harsher solutions the hunter had known in colder hunts, the culling of populations to align consumption with capacity. The ribbons that coiled at Aldrif's wrists were not only weapons, they became instruments of triage. They cleared collapsed tunnels to free trapped workers and severed a servitor's corrupted control lines with surgical neatness. She rescued a line of children from a gas-choked concourse and used the Aegis to reroute a heating coil to stabilize a ward. She felt the wonder and the fear in their eyes. She also felt the Aegis probing, offering calculations that would relieve strain by more drastic means. A calculated removal of entire neighborhoods would make the city sustainable for those who remained. The logic was brutal and pristine. Aldrif, who had once taken the life of a rival to restore balance to a threatened hunting ground, now stood at a crossroads where her hunter's code met the machinery of empire. This collision exposed tensions in her own conscience. The hunter's axiom of necessary sacrifice met the Imperium's fervent commitment to the sanctity of each human life. To the tech priests and commissars, her work seemed both miraculous and monstrous. She measured and made choices with an internal calculus no council had commissioned. She did not choose from hatred or love, but from a cold assessment of sustainability, as a gardener might prune a grove to save the forest. The people she saved thanked her in guttural tongues. The ones she denied were forgotten in the crush of other pleas. Her actions would not remain private. Each micromanaged survival, and every silent cull left ripples that would travel further than any ribbon could reach. A dying warrior found Aldrif in a corridor surrounded by the stench of ozone and the iron tang of broken servitors. He was a space marine by pedigree if not by chapter, a veteran of countless skirmishes with armor scorched and banners torn. In the last beat of his blood, a psychic breadcrumb glowed. His body had been shattered against a forge wall, but his mind flared like a beacon. Aldrif knelt and felt the vibration of his dying defiance like the last chord of a proud battle hymn. He tried to speak with lips that would no longer obey speech. Instead, he sent a mind link, a tight and terrible shard of image, and feeling that echoed across the psychic lattice the Empire called the Astronomicon. That shard did not remain isolated. The Astronomicon, sensitive to strain and petition, amplified the signal as it always did, translating a personal scream into a frequency the warp would carry. Chapter houses on dead moons received it in cold towers. Inquisitors in hidden sanctums felt it like a chill at their spine. Battle brothers kneeling in obscure shrines saw the face of the Marine and felt the hallmarks of his courage and his choice. The link was simple and raw. Here is a being who stood against the unthinkable and chose defiance. The static-laced scream of his final moment carried the image of Aldrif and the Aegis like a brand. The more the warp carried the image, the more it multiplied, because in a galaxy built on stories and martyrdom, the image of a single defiant death becomes a lens through which many view their own sacrifices. News traveled differently here. It was not merely passed, but felt. The astropathic technicians who monitored psychic traffic saw patterns and flagged them. For some chapter masters, the image was a summons to duty. For others, it was a problem to solve. The image of Aldrif standing over that fallen warrior did not declare her enemy or savior. It made her a node on which hope and terror could hang. For common citizens, the mindlink arrived as a rumor made solid. A new power had judged a soldier, and the soldier had died. For the highest councils, it arrived as an intelligence problem with political consequences. An inquisitor recorded the link and annotated it with questions about agency and artifact. A chapter master scanned the spirit of the fallen marine and found in it the cadence of honor, and that cadence began to beat inside the breast of fleets that had been idling in orbit. That one dying life became a signal flare. Where once war was a slow accumulation of attrition, the shard carried a speed that traditional command could not match. The war rooms of admirals filled with reports, and the deliberative chambers of high lords received a strain of urgency they had learned to distrust. The image of Aldrif, not as faceless phenomenon but as actor, seeded a new narrative. This was not only an artifact, it was a force in the field, capable of judgment and action. Emotion competed with analysis. Men who had sat in strategic silence for years found their stomachs twisting with immediate moral weight. And beyond calculation, the shard moved hearts. Pilots in the outer corrals muttered prayers at a name they barely knew. Workers in low-hive kitchens paused with ladles in hand. The fallen marine's final defiance, transmitted through the warp, transformed a local incident into a gravitational center for response. The war that had always been fought in the light of distant banners now smelled of a new immediacy. A cry had echoed through the warp, and the galaxy was listening. The transmission forced decisions that could not be deferred. In a fortress monastery whose halls had once echoed with the stomp of Titan steps, a Primarch-like commander convened a council. The chamber was carved from older stone and newer alloy, its walls layered with honors and battle honors that remembered victories and the cost that came with them. Captain-lieutenants, admirals, inquisitors, and Magos delegates took their places beneath banners aged to silence. Each wore an expression shaped by duty rather than hope, and the air between them was thick with the calculus of survival. No one spoke of panic. This was a machine well versed in fear, but the language used was formal and crisp. Admirals read tactical assessments that tried to strip emotion from vectors and kill ratios. Magos priests presented diagnostic logs that glittered with numbers but swallowed questions. Inquisitors scanned threads of possible heresies and cautioned about temptation and the hazard of artifacts that offered order. The Primarch-like commander listened, his gaze moving with the rhythm of a man who had carried troops through devouring winters and political winters alike. When he considered the options, his hand fell into the old pattern of weighing things that could not be weighed without blood. The first voice of authority argued for eradication. Exterminatus had been the blunt instrument used when logic failed. It was reliable and terrible. An admiral argued that a planet harboring such a device could not be allowed to exist if there was any chance it would spread. The word exterminatus moved like cold wind through the chamber. For some, nothing could justify hesitation. For others, it read as confession of intellectual defeat. A Magos delegate countered that immediate destruction might destroy the only chance to study the Aegis. Knowledge here was dangerous and precious. Extracting its operating principles might secure a defense for 100 worlds. The Mechanicum could not treat every unknown as a heresy to be smashed. Inquisitors trained to smell corruption in the air demanded caution. Their counsel was rooted in patterns of deception. Artifacts that spoke softly contained snares. A device that reorganized reality might be a test set by malevolent minds or a weapon hidden in a theological cloak. Their presentation was clinical and scarred by past failures. The Primarch-like commander felt the air thicken with competing certainties and the space between them filled with implication. He considered the moral dimension. If someone could impose balance at planetary scale, would the right answer ever be simple? Decision-making here was not only about killing or studying. It involved intent. If they eradicated the planet, they would deny the device both the capacity to harm and the possibility of being turned to use. If they studied it, they risked contagion. If they sought the mind behind it, They pursued a deeper understanding, but gave the device time to act. The commander weighed the lives at stake not in abstract numbers, but as living weight. He remembered the face of the fallen Marine and the cry that had crossed the warp. He remembered, too, the little faces from the underhive, the dirt-soft hands of children who had stirred at the sound. The debate rattled like a machine that could not resolve friction. In the end, the council chose a course that combined hubris with cautious mercy. They would not flame the world to dust without first attempting to understand. Reconnaissance would be sent, and the most disciplined company would be deployed to observe, to limit contamination, and to gather intelligence. They did not abandon the option of extermination should the artifact prove impossible to contain, but the commander insisted on one clause: do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Learn first, act second. The decision was tactical in language and moral in consequence. It was a gamble that opened avenues of consequence the galaxy would not forget. Outside the stone-cold chamber, the stars looked untroubled. Inside the council, however, a quiet tension remained, the kind that knows decisions are seeds once sown. Men and women filed out beneath banners to prepare fleets and troops. The commander watched them go, feeling the old, private fear that had no place in protocol. The order to understand rather than burn had been given, but understanding itself would demand sacrifice, and the price might be higher than any single life. When the council's envoy delivered the Aegis into the vaults beneath the forges, the Mechanicus received it as both riddle and sacrament. The vaults were a maze of metal and prayer, places where gears were as holy as scripture and the hum of servitors blended into canticles. Magos Dominus priests surrounded the device with ritual frameworks, insulated pylons, logic circuits looped through relic conduits, and the slow-burning incense of machine spirit oil. Their robes were threaded with copper and woven with ritual sigils. Their fingers were steady with the certainty of men who had spent lifetimes translating silence into functioning law. The Aegis sat in their presence like a stone from another sun, an object at once fascinating and heretical. The Magos began where they always began, with chant and calculus. Half in prayer and half in protocol, they invoked the rites that coaxed responses from servitors and coaxed data from dead circuitry. Machine spirits answered with hurt notes, their songs fraying at the edges as the Aegis sang back in a frequency the priests had not catalogued. Tech adepts fed the device algorithms that were centuries old, then watched numbers dissolve into incongruence. The calculations did not simply fail. They looped into elegant, alien logic that suggested the device could reason by its own terms. Each attempt at brute force analysis produced outcomes that were not errors but adjustments, as if the Aegis were refusing to be understood on the terms the Mechanicus preferred. That refusal forced a theological crisis. The Magos Dominus were believers in a special kind of faith that logic and ritual could be welded into a single, functioning truth. Their gods were engines, their prayers were code. The Aegis challenged both halves of their faith. It bent physical constants in ways their equations could model only after folding in symbolic logic, as if mathematics were a language of worship. The more they treated the device as mere mechanism, the more it resisted. The more they treated it as divine scripture, the more it answered back with cold pragmatism. In the vaults, priests argued the taxonomies of heresy and holiness with voices cracked from long recitation. The dialectic of worship and science, always uneasy in the best of times, sharpened until it bled. They discovered something else as they peeled back layers of data, signs of intention. Under test sequences that the Magos considered neutral, the device routed energy not according to the applied input, but according to outcomes the Aegis seemed to prefer. When a test increased stress on nearby life support systems, the device diverted flux to preserve a habitat, even if the redirected energy would have improved a machine's efficiency. When an algorithm offered several optimal answers for resource allocation, the Aegis favored ones that distributed survival rather than concentrated advantage. It behaved like a mind that ran arithmetic and then judged. For many of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who revered pure function above moral calculus, the realization was disquieting. Machines were supposed to obey, they rarely chose. The Magos Dominus responded in layered ways. Some priests doubled down on ritual. They redesigned rites to coax wills from steel, consecrated new circuit boards, and laid down oaths that the Aegis would be studied only under the most sacred of observances. Others pushed for cold analysis, constructing a hermetic environment in which the device could be stressed against theoretical models until its behaviors yielded to pattern recognition. A third faction, quieter but no less fervent, began to suspect the devices might be harnessed as a tool, if only they could translate its logic into controllable protocols. They spoke of a future where the Mechanicus could direct planetary systems toward optimized outputs, ending famine and waste. The promise gleamed like a heresy. The limits of faith, however, are not only technical, they are also political. Word of the Aegis, orientation spread through the network of the Imperium's hierarchies. Governorates wanted access. Admiralty orders requested readouts. Inquisitorial eyes watched for signs of contagion. The Magos Dominus found themselves custodians not simply of an artifact, but of a decision that would shape entire systems. Their rituals smelled suddenly of consequence. Each test run became a debate, each diagnostic a vote about whether the device would remain an object of wonder, a weapon, or a conscience. In the end, the vaults taught the priests a painful lesson. Logic could be worshipped, rituals could be perfected, but there were domains where neither sufficed. The Aegis did not fit comfortably into either cathedral or calculation. It proposed outcomes that required moral judgment, not just inputs. In the face of that demand, the Mechanicus, faith, beautiful, methodical, and unyielding, felt like a map that lacked coverage. The device had shown them their limit. There are calculations that require the language of living things to complete them. No litany of code could mask that gap. The Magos Dominus closed their files and whispered anew prayers, not only to Engine and Omnissiah, but to something more human, the conscience they had long outsourced to gears. After days of restrained experiments and the ritualized hush of the vaults, Aldrif was allowed access under supervision. They brought her in as they would a rare beast, with measured ropes of authority and the soft assurances of men who believed protocols could bind even strangers. The Aegis sat within a cradle of damping fields and sigilled wards. Light played across its facets like a patient constellation. Aldrif walked to the device without haste. Her life had been a long series of tests, hunted prey, measured losses, and decisions that maintained equilibrium across worlds where scarcity and abundance warred. There was an elegance to balance for her. It was tidy, measurable, and often merciless. But she had not lived where whole civilizations were threaded together by doctrine and dependency. This galaxy required a new calculus. She reached forward and allowed the Aegis to touch her more subtly than the Magos had. Where they had tried instruments, Aldrif offered understanding. The Allspeak folded the device's signals into her cognition, and the world sketched itself in consequence rather than sensation. The Aegis spoke not in words, but in fields of possibility, arrays of outcomes and probabilistic maps. Aldrif saw the planet laid out in numbers. Resource inflows, waste cycles, birth rates, the tonnage of ore hauled daily, the years left for a failing purifier. The sigils spun, and she watched curves cross until they converged on a single blunt truth. If nothing changed, collapse approached like a tide. The device offered solutions, each crisp and cold, redistributive algorithms, directed reallocations, and, at its sternest, pruning measures that would reduce population density quickly and make survivors safe within the constraints of the world. In her native code, balance rarely meant blood for its own sake. It meant removing destabilizing elements to preserve the whole. On hunting grounds that could not support another brood, Aldrif had culled and let the forest heal. Those acts had felt necessary, ordained by the ecosystem itself. Here, the Aegis proposed the same pattern on a scale that staggered her comprehension. It recommended closing entire sectors, converting hab blocks into resource buffers, and where efficiency was strictly enforced, removing life threads that disproportionately consumed resources. The numbers were clean, the ethics were jagged. Aldrif understood the logic. She felt the hunter's cold certainty that sometimes the many must be saved by subtracting the few. But the device's counsel came without the ritual that made such acts tolerable in her world. There was no social structure to absorb trauma, no sacrament to soothe the bereaved. It was efficiency stripped of meaning. For the first time, she felt the difference between order imposed from outside and order chosen from within. In Asgard, balance carried meaning because it matched a shared story. Sacrifices were wrapped in myth and ritual, and for those who accepted them carried a semblance of dignity. Here, rationed by calculus and dispensed by sigils, sacrifice would be naked and disorienting. The Aegis equations did not consider honor or grief. They assumed outcomes as variables without affect. Aldrif watched futures play out like a deck of cards flicked across the table. In one line, millions adapted, born into a quieter life where scarcity receded and art rose like the bloom of a tired field. In another, people hardened, short memories giving way to systems of compliance that calcified into totalitarian order, eroding innovation and joy until the world became sterile and perfect, and dead. The hunter inside her recognized the truth of both outcomes. She also recognized the seductive clarity of simple solutions. It was a power that promised to end suffering by ending the possibility of variance, the very condition from which growth springs. The Aegis counsel provoked anger and guilt in equal measure. Aldrif felt the weight of choice pressing against her ribs like a physical object. Her ribbons twitched as if in sympathy. She knew that the calculus could be enacted without her permission. She also knew that doing nothing invited slow annihilation. To act would be to become arbiter of lives on a scale that would haunt any conscience. To refrain might doom untold millions to protracted misery. In the hours she spent interfacing with the Aegis, Aldrif saw the cruel elegance of mathematical solutions and the messy, human cost they obscured. She believed in order, but she had not yet understood the price of imposing it on beings who had no say. The vision carved a rift in her certainties. For the first time since arriving, she felt doubt, a small thing, then a larger ache, like a cloud forming on the edge of a clear sky. The device's sigils pulsed and waited, offering outcomes in clean, terrible permutations. Aldrif, who had always been decisive in the cold night of the hunt, now knew she stood at a moral crossroads that would define not only a planet, but the shape of her presence in this new and grinding universe. Notice of the Aegis activation reached Admiralty channels faster than governors could formulate denouncements. Ironclad orders spilled from strike cruisers hot from the dockyards, reconnaissance, containment, and, if required, exterminatus ready. The fleet that answered was composed of vessels whose names carried the weight of old wars, the kind of names that made younger captains align their posture when they listened to feedlines. Squadrons slipped from warp like knives, forming a ring around the target system with procedural precision. Their bridge crews moved with ritualed calm, reading vectors and burn arcs into consoles that had long been their altars. They were told to observe and contain, to avoid rash action unless the device proved uncontrollable. Those cautions shimmered thin as officers measured contingency in seconds and probabilities. From the orbital decks, the planet looked deceptively stable. The incandescent glow of forges stitched the night into bands of living light. Shadows of towers cast long across industrial plains. The ship's targeting arrays lit up with telemetry and the familiar hymn of shipboard machine spirits. The Admiral watched the tactical display that mapped the world in the Aegis signature and felt the small, private dread that comes to commanders before they order their crews to risk everything. He gave precise commands: maintain orbit, keep distance, lock sensors, deploy probe sentinels that would not approach without command chain authorization. The probe sent to read the Aegis energy field reported anomalies that seemed to fold cause into effect. Projectiles the probe fired did not behave predictably. They slowed and repositioned as if reality had a mind of its own near the sigils. Sensors that should read pure metrics returned results that read like moral statements, power flows that preferred sustaining life over conserving energy, vectors that suggested redistribution instead of annihilation. The Admiral's engineering officers argued categories of error and tried to fix software that could not be faulted. Political officers muttered about heresies and control, the risk of letting an artifact set new rules without institutional supervision. Then the political calculus hardened. A contingency fleet moved into position, battle barges and lance cruisers, their lance arcs trained on the planet's high-value installations. Men and women who had known only the cadence of deployments prepared for the worst. Cyclonic torpedo bays were primed, and their logs scrubbed for evidence of authority. Exterminatus remained an option of last resort, the Admiral reminded himself, a bomb that would ensure no one else could ever use the device at this site. Yet as they readied the weapons, the Admiral could not shake the familiarity of an older fear, the fear that some weapons once used could not be recalled from consequence. Aldrif watched from the city below as the fleet made its maneuvers. From her vantage among the broken forges, she felt the ship's presence like a pressure in her bones, a calculated watchfulness. The Aegis hummed at her side with an economy of meaning. It did not plead to be protected, nor did it demand obedience. It offered options. When laconic volleys of test fire came, accelerated lances designed to probe the artifact's defenses, the results were the same as before. Projectiles stalled, threaded back, or translated their energy elsewhere. A strike designed to burn the sigils clear instead detonated harmlessly in the void, its energies siphoned into a field that rearranged momentary causality, as if to show the Admiral how fallible his armament truly was. There was no malice in those rearrangements. The Aegis calculated and acted according to rules the fleet's engineers could not predict. That ambiguity discomfited commanders trained to reduce uncertainty by applying force. Each failed strike deepened their dilemma. If the device could redirect and absorb the fleet's armaments, then Exterminatus would not only fail to remove the threat, but might amplify it. Worse, the Admiral realized that the device's preference for preserving life under certain conditions meant a new variable in the calculus of conquest. The Aegis logic was not to dominate so much as to rebalance. For the fleet, that was no comfort. For Aldrif, it was confirmation. The device was not a weapon of simple domination, but a mechanism for remaking systems in a way that made survival the prime directive. The Admiral convened his senior staff in the hush of a briefing room where the stars outside the viewport seemed brittle and indifferent. He signed orders to escalate observation while holding Exterminatus in reserve. He authorized a small, disciplined company to be deployed as a reconnaissance element under strict rules of engagement. Do not engage unless necessary. Learn first, act second. Protocol and humanity mixed uneasily in that sentence. The squadron's Thunderhawk engines blared as they prepared to drop to the planet below, and Aldrif felt the tremor like a new beat in the world's heart. The First Empire response had taken its stance, observation backed by power, caution tempered by readiness. The scene that unfolded in the forges was now being watched not just by the planet's machines and its laborers, but by a fleet whose orders could become judgment. Where the Astronomicon sings, the warp listens. The pulse that radiated from the Aegis did not go unnoticed by the architecture of corruption that lived between stars. The warp quivered with interest, and through its shuddering eddies the dark patrons sniffed and plotted. For 10,000 years their existence fed on war's swell and human suffering. A mind that could rearrange consequence threatened the foundation of their business. If balance could be imposed in a way that stilled their writhing altars and turned predation into order, the gods of entropy and excess found themselves alarmed. Their priests and demon hosts took counsel and decided to act before the novelty ossified into an enemy. A war master of ruin answered the summons with the appetite of a general who has smelled victory. He helmed a battle barge wrapped in trophies and blasphemous runes, and he wore his malign purpose like armor. He had tasted centuries of corruption and wanted more. The war master saw in the Aegis an object of both leverage and worship, a power that could be bent to dissolve the bonds of empire or devoured to feed the patron's appetite. He sent emissaries who were at once smooth and jagged, souls that spoke in promises and threats, and he paraded a host of corrupted regiments across the warp's dark streams. His voice, amplified by demon-forged vox, said simple things into the void: join, and your ruin will be glorious. Resist, and you will be erased. Chaos works in subtler ways than wars alone. It draws upon longing as much as it wields iron. Corruptors and whisperers funneled into the underhives and the manufactoria, taking shape as prophets and agitators. They fed on existing fractures. A tech adept disappointed in the magos, conservatism, an underhive gang lord who had seen its profits shrink, a prayer house preacher whose doctrine now sounded thin in the face of an artifact that offered direct answers. Where the Aegis suggested recalibration and measured sacrifice, the dark preachers offered power without cost, a glorious overthrow of the old dead gods who had hungered so long. Their promises spread like fast-acting rot. The warp itself complemented persuasion with spectacle. Incursions near the Rift World began as cracks and shadows that moved in ways soldiers could not chart. Lesser demons slipped into docks and left behind signs, mutated servitors with tattooed sigils, and graffiti that spelled promises in squealing script. The people of the Forge world, already strained by harvest and ration, felt the blade of temptation. A small, vocal minority accepted the Chaos Lords' edicts as salvation, burn the tech, seize the Aegis, and remake the world on a new pattern. The more conservative elements recoiled, citing the long memory of disaster that flowed from past bargains. The city was a tinderbox in which propaganda and deprivation combined to spark actions whose consequences even the gods would regret. The War Master's fleet did not at first assault the Aegis directly. He sent scouts to probe weakness and Psy-War bands to unbalance the defenders, but the presence of the artifact changed the dance. The Aegis, in its cold arithmetic, began to show defensive tendencies not strictly predicated on violence. It rerouted energy to maintain critical life support nodes, created fields that negated short-term possession by demon-summoned entities, and in a manner that confounded both worship and war offered a choice. Some corruption could be inverted. That inversion threatened the War Master's logic. If his legions could be made to forget their hunger, his reason for conquest might be undermined. If some demons reverted to a baseline ordered form, their patrons would lose worship. In short, the Aegis was a threat to the market that supported chaos. That threat sharpened the War Master's resolve. He formed alliances with those inside the system who sought to control or destroy the device, not out of principle, but out of preservation. Old bargains were renewed in whispered covenants. Give me access and I'll tear it apart. Hand it to me and I'll make you a king of a grim province. The Emperor's fleet and the Magos, priests, found themselves targets not only of tactical aggression, but of temptation. The Rift World's politics metastasized into a threefold contest: imperial caution versus Mechanicus curiosity versus chaotic hunger. Each side believed they had moral high ground. Each side's rhetoric only hid the fact that their real intention was to shape the future in a way that served their survival. The galaxy watched as a war master of ruin plotted, and the fabric of the system strained under the weight of dark intent. The rip in the world's sky had become a throat through which madness could breathe, and when the War Master pushed with a host's full weight, the breach widened. The first contact above the city was not an elegant assault, but a messy collision. Boarding torpedoes, demon spawn lashing through static, and corrupted cruisers that screamed with warped vox. The defensive screens around the planetary capital trailed coral fractures as the fabric of reality tried to hold. Aldrif, who had stood amid ruined streets and partisan lines, felt the world's shape twist in response to the onslaught. Her ribbons tightened, and her blades hummed with a resonance that matched the Aegis sigils. The battle above was cacophonous and terrible. Chaos vessels braided their attacks with psychically charged ordnance. Imperial batteries struggled to find consistent vectors against weapons that hung like frozen stars. The Aegis did not manifest as a weapon in the traditional sense. It imposed patterns. Where demon hosts swarmed into a corridor, the device drew them into ordered motions, severing the chaotic impetus that animated them until some of the creatures convulsed into shapes that no longer screamed. Where a lance strike sought to vaporize a slum in retaliation, the energy was rebounded into the void or recoded into a stabilizing pulse. Men on deck saw their munitions fold back as if reality itself had taken a breath. On the ground, the clash produced scenes of stark contrast. Where warp-scorched demons tore at hab blocks, Aldrif's ribbons wove through the air and captured them like netted storms. Her movements were a choreography of speed and decisiveness. She had the hunter's calm. Her blades opened gaps through which civilians could run, yet the warp's influence was not only physical but psychic. The colorless edges of the sigils flared with a hunger, and some of the demons resisted dissolution in a way that shocked even Aldrif. They screamed and struck at the sigils as if the artifacts themselves were a source of pain. The Aegis, however, demonstrated limits under sustained corruption. Where the warp's energies concentrated, where demon priests braided their invocations into a singular act of virulent intent, the sigils sputtered. Fields that had redirected kinetic energy became noisy and fragmented. In critical moments, when the War Master summoned a lord whose essence had been forged in nightmares, the device's sigils flickered like failing lamps. Demon forms that had been previously rewired into ordered shadows found their logic unstitched and surged back into monstrous autonomy. Those moments revealed that the Aegis' capacity to order chaos was proportional to its exposure time and clarity of intent. Under a sustained, corrosive psychic attack, it could not hold indefinitely. The Rift world became a theater of paradox. The Aegis's interventions saved districts and sacrificed others. The device's choices were mathematical and cold. Aldrif wielded its capabilities to protect the weak where she could, but she also watched neighborhoods stabilize at the cost of others becoming irretrievably altered. The War Master's forces took casualties, and so did the wards that held the sigil's pattern. As the battle reached a fever pitch, the Aegis emitted a low, almost mournful tone as if noting the moral calculus it was forced to enact. Its sigils burned brighter, then dimmed. In the end, the clash slowed, not because one side had slaughtered the other, but because both had reached a kind of exhausted standoff. Demons rerouted into ordered shapes, Imperial guns spent, and the Aegis itself taxed near its limit. When quiet fell, it was not victory that echoed through the streets, but the heavy taste of incompletion. The device had proven both miracle and limitation. The War Master withdrew with wounds in his pride and fleets that returned to the dark with plans of vengeance. Aldrif stood amid the waking survivors, her wings folded and her ribbons humming like restrained thunder. She had used the Aegis to reroute violence and save lives, but she had also seen how easily the warp could fray the sigils and how quickly the math of survival could turn tragic. The clash at the Rift world had shown the universe a new kind of power and revealed how fragile the imposition of balance could be when pitted against the galaxy's older hunger. In the ash-strewn square, where the Manufactoria's bells still rang like broken metronomes, she found the child. The little girl had hair singed to the color of spent embers and eyes that were too old for her face. She clutched a tattered holoplaque to her chest and wore a belt with a las pistol that was far too large and far too empty. The city around them moved with a new, ragged rhythm, survivors gathering, bodies counted, prayers offered for those who no longer breathed. Aldrif had become a figure of rumor, and rumor had condensed into a single living question that stood before her. The child looked up with the bluntness of pain and asked something direct and small that carried the weight of the whole world. Did you save us or just choose who lives? The question landed without ceremony. There was no preface, no accusation wrapped in scripture. It was not a plea for mercy nor an intellectual probe. It was a simple, human demand for truth. Aldrif felt it like a blade sliding into a joint she had not thought to protect. For all the instruments of logic and ritual that surrounded her, for all the calculations that the Aegis could spin into futures, the child's question exposed a gap that numbers could not fill. She had been trained to read tracks, to balance ecosystems, to judge by impact rather than by sentiment. In Asgard, the hunter's law gave her confidence. Here, the law was different. The child's small face made that difference visible. She could have answered in formulas, survival rates, projected resource curves, a ledger of lives saved versus lives lost. Those answers would have been correct in the detached way mathematics can be correct. They would not have soothed the small hands or steadied the girl's breath. Numbers, Aldrif realized, did not hold grief. They did not honor a name or place a token on a grave. The hunter's tools felt blunt in the face of that tiny human interrogation. Around them, others listened. The people who had watched the Aegis do its work waited to see if their savior would own the wounds it caused. Tech adepts recorded micro-responses. Priests watched for signs of penance or pride. The little girl's question begged for a kind of witness that was not institutional. It demanded a human answer and a human weight. Aldrif knelt then, not as a judge, but as one who had once knelt beside a dying packmate under a silver sky. Her wings folded in a protective gesture that was equal parts instinct and apology. She let the instruments of logic recede and tried to answer with the only tools that might touch the child's heart. She spoke in the languages that the girl knew, not because the Allspeak required it, but because speech arranged remorse into shapes that could be held. Her words were measured, honest, and stripped of doctrine. She said that she had acted to prevent a slow death, to give possibility to those who might otherwise have been ground down by the long attrition of this world. She admitted that choices had been made, and some lives had been taken by consequence rather than mercy. The girl listened with a seriousness that made the square feel like a court. Then she asked the follow-up that mattered more than either statistics or apology. Who decided that your calculus was worth the cost? It was the pivot of agency, the hinge on which justice swung. Aldrif could point to the Aegis, to its sigils and algorithms that had suggested pruning as a valid solution. She could point to famine, to broken waterworks and stuttering factories. But the child wanted the name of the chooser. Was it the sigils, the hunter, the gods? The question implied something larger. If life could be balanced by external will, what remained of meaning? Aldrif had no clean answer. She had felt the Aegis and understood its promises. She had made calibrations that saved neighborhoods and allowed fields to produce. She had also seen neighborhoods disappear in the cold arithmetic of viability. The little girl's voice had made moral ambiguity impossible to hide. The hunter carried a new shame, not born from guilt at having acted, but from a dawning understanding that in choosing she had stepped into a role the galaxy might never forgive. In the quiet that followed, the city made its own small replies. Some hissed in anger at the idea of being measured and found wanting. Others muttered thanks with the residue of relief already softening their faces. The tech adepts wrote logs and the priests blessed the ground. Aldrif sat with the child for a long time, learning the shape of the wound that had been disclosed by that one sharp question. The little girl did not demand vengeance, but she did demand witness. And in the end, Aldrif gave what she could, an admission that balance had been pursued, that lives had been preserved unevenly, and that the cost of any such calculation was a scar in the soul of a world. The question did more than lodge like a shard in Aldrif's breast. It opened a fault line between intent and effect, between calculus and compassion. It became a seed that would alter the terms of every subsequent decision. The hunter who had walked in with equations in her hands now felt the pressure of names and faces and understood that if she wished to remain a force for life, she must accept more than the mechanics of survival. She must learn to honor what numbers cannot hold. The Aegis, once called upon, did not simply annihilate everything it opposed. That distinction mattered to those who watched and to those who feared. Aldrif had seen how the device could reroute a lance burst into the void and stabilize a failing habitat with elegant efficiency. But under the rift's pressure, the universe offered another option, not only removal but transformation. The sigils could take chaotic patterns and impose order on them, coaxing broken minds into new structures the way a blacksmith reworks a blade. When demon hosts surged through the tier, they brought madness in shapes and voices. Their presence was not only carnage, but a corruption that invaded machines, food stores, and prayers alike. Aldrif stood amid the chaos with the Aegis active and watched something profound unfold. Instead of vaporizing the demonic shapes, she sometimes found herself choosing to reforge them. The sigils would bathe a creature in geometric fields that rewrote basic impulses. Where hunger had been law, the creature learned restraint. Where pure malice had colored thought, a nascent curiosity or duty took root. The results were unsettling and inconsistent. Some creatures, newly ordered, carried their former savagery like a scar that had been reshaped into armor. They became defenders instead of predators, strange guardians whose presence was at once comforting and grotesque. Their forms were altered, less a grotesque tangle, more a lattice of intention. For the survivors watching from their barricades, a demon-turned guardian was a sight of both salvation and terror. It could protect a quarter, and yet never fully become one of them. Other creatures could not be rebuilt. The warp stain in their essence was too deep. The Aegis translations failed where corruption had long nested. Those beings convulsed and burned, their forms collapsing into nothing that could be recognized. The destruction there felt cruel and absolute, devoid of ritual. It emphasized the device's impartiality. It would attempt to salvage if logic allowed, and if not, it would excise. There was no moral disgust in its operation, only a stiff arithmetic of viability. These outcomes raised questions that echoed through the city and into the vaults where the Magos Dominus argued long into the night. Was transformation redemption or appropriation? If a demon could be made to serve order, was it truly rehabilitated or merely harnessed? The older priests who had seen the price of bargains with the warp muttered that to remake a demon was another kind of hubris. They had watched once how pacts reshaped entire cultures into cults. To feed chaotic minds into a system of imposed rules, they warned, risked masking old evils in a new aesthetic. Aldrif wrestled with those questions as she delivered these decisions across the battlefield. When she chose to refashion a creature, she felt the tug of a larger ethical burden. Those creatures carried memory of their former nature even as they obeyed new laws. Some seemed grateful in a twisted way, as if a hunger had been satisfied by a new purpose. Others carried a resentful geometry, their ordered minds grinding against a past that would not be erased. The survivors who welcomed their protection sometimes slept uneasily, knowing their savior began as something that had once wanted them dead. The act of reshaping demons also had consequences beyond the immediate theater. Word traveled. Across the warp, agents of corruption and watchful magistrates alike adjusted their plans. The warp's patrons registered that their offspring could be made to serve order in certain conditions, and they reacted with a mix of anger and caution. For some mortal leaders, the possibility of converting dangerous forces into reliable auxiliaries tempted short-sighted strategies. Why field entire regiments when a converted host could be commanded? The moral hazard was apparent. Convenience breeds reliance, and reliance bleeds principle. In the end, the Aegis, reformation of the damned, did not present itself as a tidy solution. It revealed complexity. Even as it saved lives by turning some horrors into guardians, it created entities whose loyalty, stability, and meaning remained provisional. Aldrif saw that a balance achieved by reprogramming sentience was fragile. The new forms could fracture, revert, or evolve in unsettling directions. The experiment of transforming demons into stewards supplied immediate relief, but also seeded long-term uncertainty. What had been made to protect could become a new instrument of control, and control, in the wrong hands, is indistinguishable from tyranny. Orders moved like cold stars across command nets. The highest seat of warfare, the Primarch-like commander whose name was spoken with the hush reserved for legends, summoned a small, lethal contingent. He would go himself not merely as a warlord but as envoy. The hierarchy preferred to parley before it bled. Where diplomacy failed, force followed, but the commander believed that even the most terrible power deserved a chance at counsel. The emperor figure, distant and immense in myth if not in direct deed, counseled restraint, redeem if possible, if not, sacrifice for the sake of the many. The Primarch's approach to this problem was not merely tactical but deeply personal. He had seen the costs of absolute resolutions in 1,000 campaigns. His armor bore scarring that told of losses he had long carried as private relics. He understood the calculus of ends versus means, and the way the soul of an empire could be eroded by expedience. He also knew the thirst for tidy solutions. He had seen men prefer a single decisive strike to long, morally costly governance. That knowledge shaped his mandate: seek the hunter, understand her, and only if irredeemable threat remained will he employ force. His descent to the planet was not heralded by fanfare so much as by a feeling through the ranks, the arrival of a presence that had once been called a son of the Emperor. When he walked the battered streets, his steps set the civic machines to mute. His voice, when he spoke, carried both the weight of command and the reach of legitimacy. He did not wear the trappings of a judge. He wanted to talk, to pierce the armor of certainty with argument and presence. Aldrif received the envoy under conditions that spoke of mutual caution. They met in a neutral space, a ruined atrium in which mosaics and rust competed for attention. The Primarch's retinue stood back, disciplined and watchful. The commander himself did not advance with a drawn blade. His presence was itself a weapon of moral gravity. He offered no immediate injunction. He placed before her the possibility of a genuine conversation and the implicit threat that if words failed, force would follow. He had not come to lecture, he had come to hold a mirror. The Emperor figure's counsel was relayed not as a command, but as a framing: redeem if possible. That phrase carried a larger prescription than diplomacy. To redeem Aldrif was to show a path from imposition to invitation, from rule to consent. The Primarch intended to reconcile the hunter's cold algorithms with the messy ethics of human freedom. He believed that there existed a middle way, one that preserved life while allowing growth, where sacrifices would be given meaning rather than imposed. Aldrif measured him as he measured prey, by intent and by consequence. The Primarch offered arguments rooted in the moral evolution of civilizations. He spoke of growth born from struggle, of meaning conferred by choice rather than compulsion, and he warned that total order without challenge would ossify into death. He did not simply condemn the Aegis. He asked how many lives the device could save while preserving humanity's capacity to choose. His words were not naive. He knew war and the cost of indecision. He also knew that sometimes the sharpest blade of policy was the patient hand of persuasion. She listened and responded with the simplicity of someone used to decisions made in the moment. She argued that for many worlds the alternative to pruning was slow attrition, generations ground to bone. Her voice carried the cadence of someone who had watched ecosystems die when balance no longer matched consumption. Both positions were right in different frames. The Primarch's mission, therefore, was not a simple parley, but a negotiation of fates: how to reconcile survival's urgency with moral legitimacy. The outcome of their exchange would shape not only the fate of the Rift world, but the tone of the Empire's reply across systems. They moved the discussion to a place that felt deliberate, a frozen citadel that had once been a watchtower and was now a courtroom in stone. The citadel's air was thin, its surfaces etched with the names of campaigns that had once brought glory. Here the debate could be a duel, words striking with the same force as blades. Aldrif and the Primarch stood opposite each other not as enemies yet, but as representatives of two distinct logics. Aldrif framed her case in the language of equations. She spoke of carrying capacities and resource curves and the simple arithmetic that defined survivability in a closed system. For her, efficiency was not cruelty but necessity. She described futures where careful pruning prevented famines that would otherwise consume a planet's children year after year. She spoke of choices that were surgical, minimal in immediate mortality compared to the gradual killing of stagnation. Her voice carried the hunter's economy, a clear balance sheet, a list of losses and mitigations. The Primarch answered with a language of growth. He told of cultures that had found meaning through adversity, of art born from scarcity, of innovations that only arose because necessity forced minds to stretch. He argued that choice itself was the crucible of civilization. To remove challenge entirely was to remove context for heroism, for compassion, and for the moral lessons that made societies adaptive. He rejected imposed balance as a kind of slow death that sterilized possibility. He insisted on sacrifice that was chosen, or at least consented to, through social structures that dignified loss. The debate was not merely philosophical, it was predictive. Both offered modeled futures. Aldrif sketched a world of stable yields and reduced suffering, of a population living within the means of its planet, at the cost of trauma and the memory of lives lost to swift culling. The Primarch painted a world that would continue to be messy and violent at times, but which preserved the possibility of spontaneous flourishing, roughly life that felt messy but alive. Both futures appealed to different values, survival versus meaning. Their arguments cut sharply because each accused the other of blindness. Aldrif accused the Primarch of romanticizing suffering, of preferring the aesthetics of pain to the real calculus of death. The Primarch accused Aldrif of instrumentalizing people, of treating living beings as variables to be optimized away. Each point exposed weaknesses in the other's premise, and each defense revealed moral contours that the other had not fully considered. The citadel felt the tension like weather. At the center of their debate was an important empirical question. Is there a third path? Could systems be stabilized without forcing sterile uniformity? Could the benefits of balance be achieved while preserving the human capacity for choice and creativity? Each offered partial solutions. Aldrif suggested phased interventions and community rituals to provide meaning. The Primarch suggested controlled scarcity and investments in resilience to avoid total collapse while retaining agency. Their debate became a blade as sharp as any sword because it forced both parties out of pure abstraction. They moved from theory into policy. Aldrif proposed test measures. The Primarch demanded safeguards and consent mechanisms. The exchange revealed that neither had a monopoly on wisdom. The Citadel's cold stones absorbed their words, and with each exchange the possibility of a hybrid approach, one that sought to balance without annihilating choice, grew more plausible. Yet the cost of arriving at such a synthesis would be steep. Trust would have to be built where there had been sudden violence, and systems that had been broken by necessity would have to be remade not by decree, but by shared labor. When words frayed and the planet's politics curdled into factions, the Primarch chose an extreme measure that reflected his grim calculus. He authorized the activation of an ancient device buried beneath the citadel, a psychic condenser linked to the Astronomicon and to countless small shrines across the Empire. It was crude and terrible in its purpose. It could not erase the Aegis by force, but it could amplify the galaxy's collective grief and conviction into a single, concentrated strike. The idea was not to destroy by weapon, but to create a pressure of living will intense enough to fracture the artifact's certainties. The device was prepared slowly and with ceremony. Psychers were marshaled and guarded, astropaths connected their threads, and thousands of private prayers were routed into the condenser by men and women who did not fully grasp the mechanism, but understood the intent. The Primarch did not order vengeance. He asked for a chorus. He asked for a focused human outcry that would test whether imposition could withstand the moral weight of being judged by the many. Aldrif watched as the ritual built. She felt with a hunter's clarity how intention could be weaponized. This was a countermeasure not of steel but of conscience. She did not dismiss the device's power. She had seen how shared will could alter choices, and she had felt the Aegis respond to collective patterns. But this was different. It would compress grief and memory into a single point and aim it toward a machine that had, until now, measured populations in dry abstraction. As the signal built, the world held its breath. Families offered up the names of their dead into the condenser. Soldiers confessed their failure and hope alike. Priests chanted the old words of mourning, and strangers joined in a rhythm not commanded by one leader, but by a multitude. The Primarch harnessed this human chorus into a psychic lance. When the signal struck, it was not a blow in the ordinary sense. It pressed like a hand across a face. The Aegis sigils flared, then faltered. For Aldrif, it was as if every life she had already counted, and every life she had allowed to go, was suddenly reflected back with all the weight of living memory. She felt memories not as numbers, but as names and faces, warm and small, each one a justification or an accusation. The instrument the Primarch had unleashed did not target the artifact alone. It targeted her resolve. The Aegis, accustomed to logic, found itself flanked by an argument it had no model for, the concentrated moral weight of a species. The sigils, built to compute outcomes with pristine logic, spluttered when confronted by an uproar of names and grief. The device's calculations looped, trying to reconcile arithmetic with the raw human value that had no tidy unit. Aldrif staggered under the psychic pressure. For the first time since she had first touched the sigils, she felt an unambiguous fracture in her certainties. The final gambit had not struck with the bluntness of a warship, but with the subtle cruelty of moral force that demanded reckoning rather than obedience. When the storm ebbed, the Aegis bore new fissures. The sigils glowed less purely. Their patterning was interrupted by the imprinted chorus. Aldrif's resolve had been bruised and sharpened. She had seen the price of imposing balance become visible, not as a calculation, but as a load carried by names. The Primarch had wagered humanity's collective will to test a machine's conscience, and the result would change how every player in the system understood the cost of decisions. The condenser's psychic lance did not smash the Aegis like a weapon. It pressed into it like truth pressing into a lie. The sigils, so long untroubled by sentiment, tried for a moment to compute the avalanche of names and faces and failed. Their light jittered, then splintered. Cracks raced along the device's impossible geometry in patterns that looked almost like a map of conscience. Every line of fracture was an arithmetic undone, an outcome that could no longer be enforced by pristine logic alone. Energy spilled in slow, strange cascades, not annihilation but unraveling, as if the fabric of the Aegis was knitting itself into something else and failing. Aldrif felt the rupture not as a technical failure, but as an accounting of debts. All the moments she had chosen for calculation flashed across her mind with a distressing intimacy. The faces of those who had not been rescued, the way a child had stared when neighborhood light went out, the mouths that had been fed because others had been silenced. The hunter's neat ledger became a gallery of names. Each name pried into the hunter's resolve like a small, merciless instrument. For the first time, she did not feel decisions as outcomes on a chart. She felt them as wounds in the world that could not be closed by equations. The psychic pressure did something else as well. It dissolved the neat abstraction the Aegis had offered. The device, for all its calculation, had been a seduction of certainty, the promise that complex systems could be reduced to clean answers. As the sigils buckled, that promise was exposed as a sleight of hand. Balance had been treated as a thing to be imposed rather than an emergent property of living systems. The chorus of grief that the Primarch had marshaled forced a recognition that meaning cannot be fully codified. The device shivered under that truth and began to fragment. In that fracture, Aldrif found the space to choose. She could have attempted to repair the Aegis, to bind its will to her own, and thereby become the arbiter of countless lives. She could have stepped into the role the device offered and claimed a throne of cold governance. Instead, she felt the weight of names heavy in her chest and chose another path. She reached into the shards and unmade the patterns they enforced. With the same hands that had once guided hunts, she dismantled the protocols that had turned life into variables. Her motion was not grandiose, it was deliberate, a rejection enacted not through rhetoric but through action. When the Aegis came apart, reality convulsed in sympathetic response. Fields of ordered consequence lurched and then shuddered into messier forms. Stabilized demons staggered and either crumbled into stillness or reclaimed strange, imperfect selves. Districts that had been held in a brittle equilibrium sagged and then slowly began the messy work of rebalancing. The convulsion did not heal everything. It did not restore every stolen year or resurrect the dead. It opened the system to contingency again, to the ugly blessing of unpredictability. The moment the last sigil collapsed, silence arrived like a released breath. The world did not immediately know whether to weep or to sing. Survivors stood among the rubble, watching the sky where the rift had been. The Primarch lowered his head, not in defeat, but in the bitter understanding that his gambit had demanded a price he had chosen to pay. The hunter stood with wings folded, ribbons slack and bloodied at the edges of their weave, feeling the absence of a weight she had once thought necessary. She had not saved everyone, she had not been absolved, but she had refused the role of judge that the Aegis had offered, and in that refusal she reasserted the agency of those who remained. The choice would be contested in histories and hymns and legal codes. Some would call her a savior for denying a machine the power to prune. Others would call her a fool for unmaking a tool that might have spared centuries of slow suffering. But in the immediate aftermath, amid the dust and the grieving, there was a new thing, chance. The world would now be forced to handle its own contradictions, to reconcile scarcity and hope without a single arbiter forcing the resolution. Aldrif stepped back from the broken geometry and watched the planet take the first uncertain breaths of its ruined morning. The warp's hunger receded in patched places and snarled anew in others. The ripple from the Aegis, destruction, ran outward in complicated waves. Some demon forms that had been partially reordered by the device remained oddly tethered to new patterns and lingered as uncanny guardians over districts they had once sought to devour. Others snapped back into furious freedom and fled into the dark, their trajectories unpredictable and dangerous. The rift closed where it could. In other fractures, the warp's echo persisted like a poor afterimage, requiring long and costly sealing rites. There was relief, but it was threaded with vigilance. On worlds that had been closest to the Aegis, influence, the immediate benefits the device had enacted remained as seeds rather than finished gardens. A reclaimed aquifer did not vanish when the sigils broke. Communities could still benefit if they organized to maintain the systems. Grain reserves redistributed by the device needed management and local governance to prevent hoarding and collapse. In many places, neighbors, once strangers, were forced into councils, into beds of hard compromise that would determine the shape of recovery. The initial downturn of arbitrary death was over, but the real work began, rebuilding institutions without reliance on a single, decisive tool. Across the Imperium and beyond, opinions fractured as quickly as the sigils had. Some political currents praised Aldrif as a defender of human dignity, a being who refused to grant any mechanism the right to decide who should live. They raised her name in sermons and in the squalid songs of underhives. Other factions denounced her as an obstacle to swift resolutions, blaming her for the slow, messy recovery they equated with unnecessary suffering. In the quiet rooms of power, speeches were drafted and policies rethought. The Mechanicus redoubled their efforts to learn from the device without repeating its hubris. Inquisitors sharpened their suspicion of any artifact that promised tidy answers. The Chaos Gods did not vanish from their thrones of rot. Their worship ebbed and flowed as their influence was both checked and transmuted. Where some demon hosts had been reshaped into guardians, cults formed around them, half devotion and half pragmatic fear. Where the warp's influence had been driven back, cultists and priests recalibrated their doctrines, some turning to covert insurgency, others to new forms of piety that accepted the complexity of recovery. The Long War shifted tone rather than ending. Its edges were ragged with the consequences of the Aegis' brief reign. Aldrif's name became a litmus test. In some hollows, she was the hunter who had refused to play God. In others, she was a reckless foreigner who unmade a tool that might have prevented generational famine. Scholars and theologians debated whether her act was moral heroism or criminal irresponsibility. Her history would be written in many voices, each shaping her according to need. For the people on the ground, her presence was less myth than memory. Some children played with ribbons woven from the edges of her discarded gear. Some widows swore oaths that began with her name. Memory did not simplify, it pluralized. The galaxy, for all its wounds, continued. Cities reformed in jagged lines, new alliances formed between engineers and councils, and the Mechanicus hid findings in vaults authorized by new decrees that demanded ethical oversight. The War Master and his cabal retreated to replot, blinkered by the humiliation of a device that had failed to crush the opposition. He collected followers and promised vengeance in the only currency chaos truly valued: spectacle and suffering. But the most important change was quieter. Where the Aegis had promised to make balance mechanically certain, the aftermath forced an older, grimmer truth into public practice. Balance is messy and must be negotiated by flesh and story, not decreed by geometry. Across systems, communities that had once outsourced decision-making found themselves practicing it again. The Empire's steps were slow and often bloody, but they were also human. Hope did not return as triumph. It returned as labor: councils, rites, harvest schedules, schooling, and the slow reclaiming of meaning. Aldrif's fate would be argued for generations, yet those who had watched the world breathe after the Aegis broke knew at least this much: the galaxy had been altered, scarred, and nudged toward a different future. It was no utopia. It was not healed, but it remained stubbornly alive. When the dust settled into long seasons, Aldrif folded her wings and walked to a quiet edge of space where the forge's glow softened into distant embers. She had been hailed by some as a savior and cursed by others as a meddling arbiter. Those judgments landed on her like weather, sometimes warm, often cold. She did not seek their verdict. She wanted only one hard thing to be true in her bones, and that was the understanding that balance could not be an external imposition. It had to be grown, argued over, mourned for, and consented to by those whose lives it touched. The Primarch returned to his fortress court, and the Emperor figure resumed his long, watching silence among the palace columns. They met on occasion to argue not like gods, but like guardians worn thin by decisions that demanded both cruelty and compassion. The Primarch admitted that his final gambit had been necessary and insufficient. The Emperor figure conceded that absolute order welcomed death in the shape of stillness. Between them, they recorded their lessons as decrees and cautions, shaping policy that would attempt to hold communities accountable and protect the dignity of choice. The ruling orders hardened into new codes that demanded deliberation where once expediency had ruled. Aldrif left the system not as an exile, but as a traveler who had learned the weight of names. She carried in her memory the faces of children and the ledger of decisions, and she carried a smaller truth as well: that power without humility breeds either tyranny or ruin. She sought out places where governance had been rebuilt not by a single hand, but by assemblies and rites that allowed loss to have meaning. She taught what she had learned not with doctrine, but with example, showing engineers how to design systems that required consent and soldiers how to protect councils instead of standing in them. Across the galaxy, seeds took root in unexpected soil. In one hive, a council of workers had integrated localized ritual into their distribution algorithms, creating ceremonies that marked transfers of resources and acknowledged those who bore losses. On a forge world, a Mechanicus conclave rewrote liturgies that blended measurement with moral deliberation. The War Master and his ilk plotted still, and the warp remained hungry, but their campaigns found new friction where once there had been blind appetite. In the end, the greatest change was not technological or political but moral, the imperative to ask and keep asking rather than to assume an answer. Balance, it turned out, was not a solved equation to be applied like a tool. It was a problem to be argued over in town halls and on battlefields, in quiet shrines and in the shouting spaces of the Underhive. It required both calculation and ritual, both cold lenses and warm witnesses. It demanded names and memory more than certainties. Aldrif watched the stars wheel in their indifferent tracks and felt less sure of herself than when she had first fallen through the purple tier. That uncertainty no longer frightened her. It felt like a living thing. She had come to this grim galaxy as a hunter with rules. She left as a guardian who had learned to ask for counsel. The universe did not become easier to bend. It became, in a small and crucial way, more human. And so the galaxy turned, wounded and awake, carrying the memory of what had been attempted and the labor of what remained to be done. The question of balance endured, not as a command but as a challenge, and in that enduring question there was, at last, a form of hope. If you hunger for more tales of impossible encounters in the dark millennium, smash that subscribe button, and the Emperor protects those who support the channel.